Magic the Gathering's recently released Adventures in the Forgotten Realms products are an enchanting opportunity. A crossover of two pop culture behemoths with the potential to draw even more fans for both Magic and Dungeons & Dragons. But mashups like these are tricky. Combining two games that have some similar themes but very different mechanics is no easy feat. How did the design teams at Wizards of the Coast craft this set to encapsulate the feel of D&D on the bones of MTG's core gameplay? What tools did they use to encourage our suspension of disbelief, to make us feel like we're in the world of the Forgotten Realms? We're going to venture into the dungeon and discover the ingenious magic at the heart of Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, today on Draw 5 Move 5. Hey everyone, and welcome to the table. My name is Gabe, and this is Draw 5 Move 5, the show where we draw connections between the mechanics behind our favorite games. On September 1st, 2020, Wizards of the Coast announced Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, a Magic the Gathering set based on the primary campaign setting of Dungeons & Dragons via their Twitter page. I have not stopped thinking about this since it was revealed. I knew I'd have to do a video on it. There have been some joke promo cards and references before, but this was something special. My favorite RPG and my second favorite TCG, sorry, Yu-Gi-Oh! Will always be first for me, were about to merge in the most fantastic way possible. And seeing how effectively that would be realized in the set's design was something I knew I needed to cover. I run a TCG game design channel. If you've been here for any length of time, you could have seen this coming a mile away. Which, if you're new here, welcome. We just passed 1,000 subscribers, and if you enjoyed the video, help keep the channel growing by subscribing or sharing with your friends. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. The idea behind game and pop culture crossovers like Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is to combine the themes and mechanics of each source to make a compelling end product that can cross over fans of one series into the other. Dungeons & Dragons has actually done this a few times before with Magic, printing source books like Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica and Mythic Odysseys of Theros, which were set in several of MTG's planes. The idea dates back to the Planeshift series of books by D&D and MTG designer James Wyatt. Wyatt was also on the vision design team for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the group responsible for capturing the themes and core mechanics for a Magic set early in development. In order to make a crossover like this effective, the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, or AFR for short, design teams needed to capture what makes Dungeons & Dragons Dungeons & Dragons, translating those ideas into the set's design. Many of the things that are core to D&D, community, creative problem solving, and fighting monsters, are also core to Magic the Gathering's gameplay, so these would fill in naturally during the design process. But other elements, the fantasy environment, the character growth, dice rolling, and dungeon crawling, would all need special attention to translate effectively. To achieve this, the team had a few key goals. First, the themes, or flavor and feel, of Dungeons & Dragons and its fantasy environment needed to be present in card text, art, and mechanics. Second, some of the most iconic gameplay elements from D&D, like dice rolls, leveling up, and dungeon delving, would need to be adapted into MTG mechanics. And third, the set still needed to retain its identity as a Magic the Gathering product. Design philosophies from prior sets needed to continue, and above all, it needed to be the inverse of source books like Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. The goal was to build a Magic set with D&D themes and mechanics, rather than an MTG take on the D&D RPG system. Starting with flavor and feel, the Vision design team focused on three core aspects of the D&D aesthetic: well-known characters, fantastical creatures and objects, and the thrill of adventure. The team zeroed in on the Forgotten Realms setting as their fantasy focal point. Dungeons & Dragons, like Magic the Gathering, has many planes and worlds with vastly different themes. Many players even build their own worlds to tell stories in. The Forgotten Realms and their iconic characters are the closest thing to a core world, though, and their general fantasy theming, as opposed to the gothic horror of Ravenloft or high-tech magic of Eberron, would reach the broadest audience. Faerun, the central continent of the Forgotten Realms, is a world of mighty heroes, powerful foes, and ancient, long-gone empires whose riches and secrets lay forgotten beneath the earth. It's why it's called the Forgotten Realms. Many of those characters appear as legendary creatures in the set. The iconic heroes written into being by R.A. Salvatore in his Forgotten Realms books, beginning with the Crystal Shard, are perhaps the best example. Many famous Dungeons & Dragons characters, like Dris Do'Urden, Brunner Battlehammer, Wolfgar, and Catti-brie, originated in these books, and were adapted to cards in the AFR products by the Magic design team. D&D's creator, Gary Gygax, had several characters who would later become famous. His wizard, Mordenkainen, the Master Magician, has traveled to the Forgotten Realms on more than one occasion, and both he and some of his spells appear in this set. Even classic villains and characters from adventure modules appear, with the likes of Xanathar, Acererak, Asmodeus, Volo, Orcus, and more. The Forgotten Realms is also a world of fantastic creatures and objects. It's a world of giants, dragons, gods, dragon gods, goblins, and many artifacts both mundane and magical. These creatures and items make up not only the legendary tales of Faerun, but the common denizens and their lives. Beholders, fairies, and even just plain old people getting by as best they can. All are part of what makes the Forgotten Realms and any Dungeons & Dragons world believable. Seeing them represented here really cements that fantasy element and immerses players. Finally, the Forgotten Realms are a place of exciting adventure and daring tales. This isn't just true of these lands but of any Dungeons & Dragons setting, and it's represented here in card names and flavor text, and even art. Some cards are designed and named after classic D&D spells like Magic Missile and Meteor Swarm. Many card texts have little pieces of flavor sprinkled in to describe their effects, often related to names and abilities in Dungeons & Dragons. Choose Your Weapon references two fighting styles available to the fighter and ranger, while creatures like Battlecry Goblin and Minion of the Mighty mention pack tactics, an ability where multiple creatures attacking together gain advantage in the game. There are even spells that represent common adventuring events and plot hooks. You hear something on watch, you see a guard approach, and the classic you meet in a tavern. They also feature the same set of 4 legendary creatures from this set in an adventuring party in their art, which is a nice storytelling bit. Perhaps my favorite decision of this kind, however, is the inclusion of adventure hooks and descriptions as flavor text on basic lands. This swamp, number 272, is a great example. In a normally blank text box, a blurb has been added. As you trudge through the sewers of Baldur's Gate, it dawns on you. Where are all the rats? This is a fantastic storytelling moment, describing a location, an event, and a question that invites mystery and discovery. It's everything the Forgotten Realms are about, distilled into a small blurb that didn't need to be there, but its inclusion makes the set feel all the more like a story is unfolding, like it is a Dungeons & Dragons set. The alternate artwork cards are also a great reference to the game, with a variety of lands drawn as old-school adventure module books, and creatures drawn as they might be depicted in said manuals. Most of these flavor choices work well to encapsulate the fantasy and feel of both the Forgotten Realms and Dungeons & Dragons as a whole. Though there are some choices that baffle me, which we'll talk about later. I'm looking at you, you happen upon a glade. We'll get back to you later. What would flavor be, however, without mechanical design to reinforce it? Next, the AFR design team explored what would make up the core mechanics of the set, as well as how to convert the flavor of each reference into mechanics on cards. Every Magic the Gathering core set introduces a few new mechanics and brings back others. In this set, there are 3: dice rolling, leveling up, and dungeon exploration. The first new mechanic is pretty straightforward. A variety of cards, like Lightfoot Rogue, have an ability that requires you to roll a 20-sided die, or d20. This is the mainstay dice of Dungeons & Dragons, and after rolling, you consult the chart on the card, a nod to the result tables in various D&D rulebooks, which is a nice touch. The higher you roll, the better the outcome, and rolling a 20, often called a crit, will have a far better outcome than any other roll. Several cards in the commander decks use different kinds of dice, like D6 or D12, since those products don't need to be balanced for tournament play, and asking a player to carry around 3 or 4 different kinds of dice they wouldn't already be using is a bit much. When bringing dice rolling to Magic, the team had to consider that unlike D&D, where several players fight together, this is a tournament game where players are usually dueling one-on-one. As such, it was important to focus on each card always doing something regardless of the roll, whereas in D&D it's okay to have a chance of failure based on the likely outcome. Each card has an increasing power of effect, where the lowest roll still does something but maybe wasn't worth the mana spent to play the card, while the higher ranges have more powerful effects. Effectively, each dice rolling card does something so the player doesn't feel bad spending limited resource, mana, on it, while locking stronger effects behind a lucky roll. The second new mechanic is a new enchantment type, the class enchantment. There's not too much to say on these. The design team took inspiration from the level up mechanic on creatures in Rise of Eldrazi and applied it to a saga-like enchantment, melding the two into class enchantments like the wizard class. Each has a mix of permanent and one-time abilities, and paying mana will cause the enchantment and, by extension, the player to level up, unlocking a new ability. They're flavorful and functional, each class fits its source material well, not much else to say. You done good, wizards. The final mechanic is Venture into the Dungeon, or Venture for short. This one is a lot more complex than the last two, but for a mechanic trying to encapsulate the entirety of taking an adventuring party through a dungeon from top to bottom, fighting creatures and earning loot along the way, I think they did well enough. The Magic design team made a new card type called a Dungeon. Whenever an ability with the phrase "Venture into the Dungeon" on it resolves, a player can pick one of these dungeons and put a marker on the first room, activating its room ability. So, as a basic example, Nadar here ventures into the dungeon when he enters the battlefield. You pick a dungeon, we'll say it's the Tomb of Annihilation, you place it off to the side with a marker on the first room, and that first room ability triggers. All players lose 1 life, then you continue with the game. Each time you venture after a dungeon is in play, you move 1 room deeper and trigger that ability. When you reach the last room, you trigger its ability and exit the dungeon, completing it. So in our current example, Nadar also ventures whenever he attacks. Attacking 3 times will trigger each of the abilities of the tomb and complete the dungeon, netting you a cool zombie god token for your troubles at the end. Some cards in this set care about completing dungeons specifically to give you effects, like Acererak, who now makes zombies when he attacks since we finished the tomb. And once you finish a dungeon, you can choose to run through it again, or pick a different dungeon for different effects, like Dungeon of the Mad Mage. There's a lot going on here, but the mechanic encapsulates the concept of struggling down through a dungeon to earn rewards. While there are 33 cards in the main set that can venture, many of them only do so once or have a high mana cost to do so repeatedly, so in some cases it can be challenging to earn the dungeon's rewards. As it should be. Dungeons are not meant to be a walk in the park. In addition to the new mechanics, the way many cards are made just mechanically fit what they're a reference to. Magic Missile and Meteor Swarm, which I mentioned earlier, both act like the spells they're based on. The first can't miss and you pick the targets to hit with small amounts of damage, while the second does a large amount of spread damage. This continues through many cards in the set. Xanathar is a paranoid beholder who wants to know many things and control as much of what happens in Waterdeep as possible. Fittingly, his card lets you control another player's deck and hand for a turn to use their knowledge and power as your own. Volo, meanwhile, is in constant search for new and fascinating beasts to add to his bestiaries. As such, for every new type of creature cast, he copies it to his notes and to the field. One might call it a field guide. All of these hit the mark exceptionally well. And note of hitting the mark, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms was still a Magic the Gathering product, a replacement for the 2022 core set at that. Design conventions from prior sets needed to carry over, and it still needed to function as a standard Magic product. Failing to do so would make the product feel less like an MTG set, alienating some of its core audience. Much of that continuing design philosophy is in trying to balance the 5 colors, or color pie, giving white and red some much needed help as they both tend to be lacking in the most important parts of core gameplay, ramp and card draw. White's catch-up mechanics continue with Loyal Warhound, giving you more lands, and since it has the most cards that care about the new dungeon mechanic, I think in the standard format at least, they saw this as a way to patch up some of White's shortcomings. Red, meanwhile, gets several impulsive and cycling draw effects like Chaos Channeler, You Find Some Prisoners, and Unexpected Windfall, as well as a number of cards that can create temporary mana via treasure tokens. Both also continue the new direction for their color pair, focusing on artifacts since it's shall we call it rebranding from Boros to Lorehold in the Strixhaven set. We still see cards like Brunner and Fighter class supporting that old equipment and attacking strategy, but many more interesting artifacts are exclusive to Red and White now, like Dancing Sword, Portable Hold, Boots of Speed, and the Book of Exalted Deeds. We also got a really cool artifact synergy card in Oswald Fiddlebender, who fuels the grave while cheating into more powerful artifacts. Red and especially White still have a lot of catching up to do, but it's progress. It's what we've been seeing in previous sets like Modern Horizons 2. General design philosophies continue as well. White adds more combat, lockdown, and now phasing cards to their ranks. red focuses on chaos, having the most die-rolling effects in the set. Green gets more land and creature-related cards, same thing you'd expect. Blue gets more card draw and control effects, again, pretty bog-standard stuff. Black continues to focus on sacrificing something to get more in return. It's all pretty par for the course, but that's what it should be. It's still a Magic set, and the colors have identities in what they do best. Green and blue are still clearly the strongest, and they still get some powerful tools here like Circle of Dreams Druid and Gretchen Titchbelow, but it feels more even than it's been in the past. Overall, Magic's current design philosophies are carrying over well in this set, maintaining a status quo for the wilder aspects of a crossover to build upon. Before we wrap this up, I do want to talk about potential improvements and missed opportunities in the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms products. If you recall, I mentioned You Happen Upon a Glade earlier. It's a fine card, except for one tiny thing. Why is the second mode called Make Camp, instead of an actual Dungeons & Dragons term for a rest, either short rest or long rest? While I'm overall happy with the flavor of the cards in this set, there are a ton of slam dunks, there are certain missed opportunities in flavor like this that crop up. Some of the adventure hooks on the lands, for example, are a bit bland. Take Mountain number 276, for example. You venture deep into the heart of the mountain to determine what can calm its quaking rage. It's a little ominous, but there isn't really any obvious question here or even a path forward. Kind of just sets a location. It works fine enough and there are some implied questions, but in text like this, the flavor text on Tiamat and so on could really have used a few extra passes. Mechanically, there are also some cards in the set that fail to translate their source material effectively. The Tarrasque is probably the best example. In standard Dungeons & Dragons, it's a nigh unkillable beast. Literally a beast, mind you, like the token beast within makes, not a dinosaur. With a hide that can reflect or repel most attacks, leaving devastation in its wake. I see what they were going for with the ward mechanic and the fight trigger, but it's 9 mana with 3 green. Couldn't we have given it indestructible, or a spell redirection effect, or a weird board wipe on artifacts when it attacks? It's a city-crushing behemoth. Green as a color has plenty of enchantments and artifact removal. It'd be on theme. There are other random things like this, from other sort of wrong creature types like Blink Dog and Rust Monster, to abilities that don't quite fit like the gem-consuming Zorn doubling treasure production, and Sepulchre Ghoul having no abilities that even remotely resemble a ghoul's paralysis effect, probably the most well-known thing about them, and makes them more distinct from other zombies. Again, these are not everywhere in the set, and a lot of what we have hits well, but there are a few duds here compared to the other great adaptations like Xanathar and Volo. Finally, for a core set designed around Dungeons & Dragons, there were a few cool mechanics that could have come back, which I'm surprised it didn't. The level up mechanic doesn't really seem to have been a hit with players, and it was an influence on some of the other design in the set, so I can see how it'd be overlapping and maybe they didn't want to include that. Adventure is in a similar boat, though its 2-part story aesthetic would have fit one of D&D's core pillars to a T. Part of their exclusion may also be because this was initially planned to be a core set, so they were trying to keep complexity to a minimum, but Rosewater himself admits that went out the window in favor of creating the best D&D set they could. Out of everything though, I think the lack of the party mechanic introduced in Zendikar Rising is the biggest disappointment for me. This mechanic focuses on more powerful effects the more party types, cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard, you control, all of which are, or are so close they might as well be, D&D classes. Specifically, these were the 4 main classes in the first edition of the game. Rogue came in like a supplemental set, it was the first supplemental set, but it's close enough. Bringing this mechanic back for the D&D set would have been a perfect fit, and the mechanic is barely a year old. They did print more creatures of the party types, but the fact that it wasn't here at all is just odd to me. Especially when they made a theme of having a 4-part adventuring party on all of the you do a this, you see a this cards. It's in this set, in the legendaries that form that adventuring party. Nadar, Eliwick, Hama Pashar, and Varus. But only one of them is one of the party types. Nadar could have been a fighter or a warrior as opposed to being a knight, and Eliwick and Varus are not any of the types. Varus maybe could have been a rogue, and Eliwick could have been, I don't know, another wizard, a cleric. She's a bard, it makes sense, but This just feels like a really big missed chance in this set. Having that core party mechanic showing in a cycle of cards in the set who all were focused around going into the dungeon. Maybe that's why, maybe it's because there was too much going on combining the dungeon stuff and also doing the party thing on the same sets of cards. They could have been different cycles, I don't know. I saw a mention that the design team for AFR shot the idea down, but I couldn't find a source for this, so I can't really confirm it. Whatever the case, I think the lack of the party mechanic is probably the largest missed opportunity in an otherwise fantastic set. There's so much more I could and would go in depth on, but this video is already long enough and I started rambling off script in that last segment, so I'm gonna call it here. A crossover between two of Wizards of the Coast's biggest properties was a massive undertaking, and one I think the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms design teams did fantastically. There will always be missed opportunities, things that could have been done differently, but at the end of the day, this set captures the feeling, lore, and mechanics of not only the Forgotten Realms setting, but Dungeons & Dragons as a whole. The effective implementation of different creatures, spells, and items through both flavor, text, and mechanical iteration is a real strong point to this product, as are the new mechanics, and Magic's main design philosophies still shine true here. Through careful planning and making specific themes and references into each card, the AFR design teams made a crossover to be proud of, and one we can look to for design advice when we want to pay homage or pull ideas from another source in our own games. Thank you so much for watching. You have my humble and eternal gratitude. What did you think of the conversation? How well do you think the MTG design team did with this crossover? Is there anything cool you learned from this breakdown of the process? And did you like this more focused discussion on a specific game design case? I've had some people asking me to do that more in the comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so let's keep this discussion rolling down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and dingling that notification bell so you never miss an update. As I said at the onset, the channel just passed 1,000 subscribers, and honestly guys, I'm over the moon. This wouldn't have been possible without each and every one of you that decided you like this kid and his game design discussions enough to stick around. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I mean it when I do that whole "you have my humble and eternal gratitude" thing. YouTube is a community. I wouldn't be here without you. Anyway, I'm finally getting back into the swing of things after a longer break than I anticipated, so I'm trying to get back into a schedule. At the very least, I'm aiming to do one video a month like always, but when they'll come out is not exactly solid. Right now, that notification bell is your best friend, so turn it on to make sure you never miss an update. Like the video to let me know you want to see more, and follow the channel on Facebook and Twitter at Draw5Move5, as well as here on our shiny new community tab, ding ding ding. Again, thanks to all of you, you're awesome, I love you. That one is probably the most likely to get updated since it's here on YouTube and you're all going to see it, but I try to update the others, so however you choose to follow, you won't miss any updates or cool game design stuff I find to share with you. My name is Gabe, this is Draw5Move5, and until next time, go have a good game.